Hello and welcome to 782. It should be. Let's have a change here. It's about 5:30. It's a very lovely day we had here out in Egvena. Sunny, and maybe I got a little suntan. I don't know if the sun was strong enough, but it was certainly a most beautiful day. And I'm going to do a lecture today called Stepping Out of Origo, or the Origo to be correct. This is inspired by the realizations I had about typology. How could I explain this? Well, we talked about two things earlier, posteriori, anteriori, and also origo and non-origo. And if we think about those two things sort of in this at the same time, that we think position that is decided in advance where the origo is, and a point in time that's it's decided in advance, something that is a posteriori, that after the fact we decided what the position should be. It's something predetermined. We already have an attitude about how it is, a sort of a tension. And that tension could also be that there is no balance in the system. We are not balanced as we stand. We have an attitude, we are standing on our toes. We are going into it, or whatever it is, with a predetermined attitude. Something that is a measure taking after the fact. And something after the fact, based on the past, so to speak, will become a fixed position. So this is something almost that lingers on, something that it's a little bit similar to have a chip on the shoulder, that you have a pre-attitude somewhere, and that chip on the shoulder tells you what the world is before you see the world. I got the idea from with this chip on the shoulder from the Chippewa tribe. Yeah, that's an internal joke. Somebody who has a chip on the shoulder has a predetermined attitude how the world is. In this Chippewa tribe example, it's the world is unjust. It's not fair. This is another way of understanding the origo. Is something predetermined. We'd already decided where it's going to be before things were settled or anything was allowed to appear for us, before the presencing. A predetermined attitude. And this is another way of relating to things we spoke about before. And this is one of the reasons blocking out or crossing out is helpful. And here I use the idea of no self, but I'm going to block it out. going to cross it out to see that no self and no self block out can actually be the starting point. We earlier saw this as a passivity. That could also be the case. That we take something from the past and we determine the future to be. That is a sort of passivity. And the passivity is that we are unaware, not intentionally affected by the past. We think the past is going to affect something, and we see the world as predetermined in certain ways. One obvious example of this is the ontic foundation. Before we even have the chance to investigate the world, it was decided that it consisted of something, the stain. So this is almost the same thing as we said before. Almost, I say. Very, very close to exactly the same thing. But there is a little difference, and the difference is whether it's a posteriori, something based on the past, or it's allowed somehow to be new in a way, fresh, not decided. This is a way of getting away from the ontic, because the ontic can never ever be criticized, argued against, never ever, because that is going to reinforce it. We cannot see it as a negative, we can't see it as anything bad. Every time we do that, we reinforce it. Because the problem is slightly different, and this is very important. It's slightly different. And this is one of the reasons this cannot be understood without some practice. One needs to do this. It's not enough to understand. It needs to be practiced as well. And every try to understand it as it is, as is explained now, will make yourself ununderstandable. You will not be able to understand. And one could call this seeing the world without structure, models, constructs, not using the object in space in front of subject. But there will still be a structure to reality. It's just that the structure is not something made up beforehand in the same way. We actively construct it for the reason. And there is the difference. One could say the intention, the planning, the thinking is different. That there is thinking. So we could say this becomes activated with thinking. And thinking is also the practice, actually doing something, some bodily training that is pre-organized, disciplined, and systematic. Within this training there is knowledge inherent, because the systems, the yoga, the tai chi, the qigong has been made up for centuries, millennia, and it contains the knowledge on how we human beings can go into not being stuck in a premeditated thinking and see it in this involuntary structure. and thereby you are opening up the meaning space, the intention space. Meaning space, it's the width of an expression. And this is the typological insight I had that I'm trying today to explain. I don't know if I succeed because it's completely new, but think about the ordinary intention. This is intention with an S. I need to enforce. Intention meaning. That's just one line. It doesn't have any width to it. It doesn't have any depth to it. It's the monosemic line. Broaden that instead by bodily practice and also understanding the double nature of reality. It has a dual nature. Being stuck in oneself or one no self will not suffice. We need to have both at the same time, and that is thinking. This is actually what Edward de Bono meant by asymmetric thinking, something that he had great trouble making understandable for the general public, I'd say. What on earth is asymmetrical thinking? It didn't really help in this case that you know what it was by heart, because this he tried to make conscious as well, and that's very hard. You can make a drawing as he did, that there is some sort of line and that gets disrupted. You have that moment of the pun in the joke, the actual point of the joke, or something that all of a sudden becomes absolutely absurd, and you have this break. I'd say that's something that doesn't open up to understanding. I think you already need to know what it's about to understand that explanation. But we have discussed earlier that de Bono hardly made himself comprehensible, although he was speaking in such a pedagogic language, but there was some problems in making this very unusual thing understandable. I'd say that Derrida tried the same thing. He didn't want to establish anything. He didn't want to establish clear arguments for a good reason, because you are still in the same ballpark if you do that. Another way of thinking about this is the monocellular organism that I mentioned before, the autopoiesis organism. Think about the cellular wall being too thick, so in the end nothing can penetrate into it. It become not only a barrier but an impenetrable frontier, and this is distancing. You are no longer inside reality. You are no longer, as Heidegger would say, already in reality, but instead you assume that sometime you haven't been in reality, and you can look at your past as it wasn't your past, going up in the transcendental ego, and you see it at a distance. And this distant thing becomes the fixed origo that you put as an attitude before you go into the situation. And you won't let presencing come to you. You won't let reality come to you, because you preempt reality. You tell before you even heard it, what is the joke? What is the storyline in something you read? What is the purpose of something you hear before you even heard it, or after maybe you heard half of it? One could also say that this Predetermined ergo is a sort of generalized subject, a generalized self. And this is something we can use the term self with a big letter S, or maybe better self underlined like this, a sort of reified self, higher up self. But this self is generalized, it's not your self. You haven't gone into yourself, you haven't balanced yourself up, you have no connection to yourself, your actual embodiment, and that becomes a reified self, a unitary self, almost like money. And this money-like universal self is also the self that constructs the generalized objective reality. And this is what we call the perceiving subject. A subject that takes information from the outside, goes into the eye or whatever, and it perceives processes within, analyze and outcomes action. This is this model. This is a model of distancing. This is after the fact. This is establishing only self or new self. Only self or new self. That's very important. One of those two things. Not at the same time. No self, of course, is the view from nowhere. So it's fair to say that the universal subject, the self underline that we have today in the modern fragmentized world of Western culture, is the equivalent of the generalized objects. Predetermined, already situated out there, almost already perceived before you even perceive them. They have always been there somehow. Nobody knows how, but somehow. Something that in the end will lead to existence without a doer or a maker, eternal numbers, multiple worlds, you name it, all those things. But that's in the long run, far from where we are at now. In the long run, take it to an extreme, you will be stranded with a world that already pre-made, always been there. Just question, how on earth do you tell the difference? Well, one way of doing that is you feel more energized in your body. You get more energy, you get more prana. This is why training something practical is absolutely necessary. Otherwise you won't be able to feel, perceive or be in the difference. And this was one of the more odd conclusions that came out of looking into the meaning space, the intention space, the broadening of what is only the line, what is the sequence with before and after, and that is that something need to be polysemic to have one meaning only. That's an absolute necessity. If you want to have one definitive absolute meaning that is completely decisive, completely means only one thing. It needs to be polysemic. And this seems to be a contradiction. And the contradiction evolves because of the confusion of posteriori and anteriori. There is no contradiction. Actually, what we call contradiction is the sine qua non for this to work properly. And this also gave me more and deeper understanding to what Ian McGilchrist called the left hemisphere dominance of the world. The left hemisphere dominance of the world is to work with representations. But it's very tough to understand what representations are. But they are exactly this. That's something that is made up in advance. Thinking of only no self or self. Starting point or a non-starting point. And you see, this of course goes into logic as well. We are speaking about contradictions. And we need this nil situation here, neither. Otherwise it will be very hard to understand this. Another thing that I mentioned before is the cell. It's obvious at first with a cell we have an established inside and an established outside. Those things couldn't exist before. Now they do exist. But the inside and the outside still in some views are the same. Remember, the Klein bottle is a helpful tool here to visualize this, to get that into your body, and that's a sort of relaxing feeling. You really feel present in another way. So that also gave me another way of explaining the passivity. The passivity is also this permanent attitude, this fixation, fixed attitude of things, how they should be. It's a fixed attitude, what you are as a self, what you want, what is your intentions. You are distancing yourself to yourself. Don't have the contact, you don't live in it, you don't penetrate into yourself, live yourself. You are the transcendental consciousness, far from you have self lifted above. And this is almost exactly what we need to counteract with the practice. Lower, getting this further down. Preferably to the navel. This is where you can find a balance. So to not seeing a problem with no self and crossed out no self. There is a certain stuckness to this. You're stuck in your vision and you can feel that. Think about the early morning when you are open in your thinking and whatever presents itself to yourself can be there. It can just exist. You don't need to sort of grasp it before it's there. And that's a change of vision. And it's so interesting when I read Ian McGilchrist the first time in July or August, when it was, really carefully when I was abroad and had a chance to do that. And I realized what happened in antiquity after the Iliad and the Odyssey, when we got new words for vision and we got a word for vision that took an object. That is that first step in the formation of something getting hardened, getting more fixated. It's not being as flexible, flowing. It's lacking energy, it's lacking vividness, it's lacking color, it's lacking almost all perception. It doesn't have smell, it doesn't have depth. I think that's a very good word. The sense of depth. And what will happen in the end is you have to construct a depth like this with x, y, z. This is what Descartes did. He obviously did not feel or understood any depth to reality. This is not depth. Depth is something much more real. This is the space. It's the typology of real space. There you have depth. This is not depth. And obviously there's a lack of energy in the passiveness. Imagine yourself just watching something happen. What will you feel in such a situation? Maybe something interesting has happened. You just found some gold somewhere and you just look. This is the passiveness we sometimes experience when we daydream, and the daydream is not that good. We're not actively controlling anything. We're not reacting. There's no response. We are very, very far from good sportsman or somebody who's reacting, who actually do anything. And that's important because the life world is not the same for everyone. For a person that has a passive attitude, the world will be different. Will be much closer to a monosemic reality by itself. That's that path. That is the path taken. Going to passivity, you become more passive, and everything you see is having this dull sense of not being alive. And that's not active perception. It's a perception that's already determined, already narrowed. It's more like a one-dimensional line, not something two-dimensional. It's not as broad. It doesn't have a base, to speak. It doesn't have a base. It doesn't have a foundation. And this broadness makes it possible to have more energy into the system, to be very specific and decisive when needed, and very broad and very encompassing when needed. Reality doesn't have fixed positions. It doesn't say in every instance a sharpness is needed, or in every instance a broadness is needed. It has both. It's reality. We can't decide beforehand what it is. We have different modes of perceiving that correspond to different attitudes of the world, not only within ourselves, but of the world itself. The world out there has specific qualities that you can learn to recognize in your bodily system. That's why I mean once more, without practice this will not be understood. And that's in itself, I think, a very, very good point to topology as a good thing. And this came up in the discussion of topology this Saturday, 2 days ago. And when I spoke to the professor, he said he's practicing meditation to sharpen his mind, to become more active, more vivid, more agile, more reacting. And it's a proactive way. You think ahead. You don't wait until it happens by itself. Yeah, that's about it. It's the first prequel going in more to this space situation. But space applies to all areas. Topology, we know earlier from Rappaport, he uses in all subjects, but it's an important thing to understand more. We need to get into topology to understand what we are doing and how the intention space, what sort of qualities does it have? Because it has different qualities and they're not predetermined. It's not like Newtonian space where everything is X, Y, Z and The space in itself here is inert, doesn't move. The origin is inert, it doesn't move, and that was decided beforehand. It's not exactly like that. It's a more movable, flexible vision of the world. And I think I end there, and I wish you a really pleasant afternoon or evening almost. It is 6 o'clock. I say thank you very much and have a nice day. Bye bye.